Sound speeds, and welcome to the Speed Bumps podcast. If you have not been keeping track, this is episode number 9. And if you don't know what in the world this podcast is about, it is me driving home from set, answering a viewer question, and then elaborating on something related to sound. This is something that I can do very easily, talk about sound, continuing to talk about sound, and then talk even more about sound during my drive home, as opposed to going home and being frustrated with trying to write a long email and reply to someone's technical question. But I digress. Here's what's new about this episode this week. I am the same as always, recording using a microphone, which is an Octava MKL12 with a swivel hiding right up here, and it goes down the it's actually a collet, but they call it the extension cable that goes into a DAD HD-TX to record. Then that audio is brought into Reaper and it is processed. The primary processing that I'm running through it is Clarity VX Pro, which is from Wyze and is a very powerful plugin. And there's various different things going on in this podcast. I may drop out the background noise to make it very, very low and then add back in a little bit. I don't know exactly how I'm going to be doing this just yet as of the time of this video, but if you don't hear much background noise while I'm driving, that would be the reason why. If you hear a little bit, it's being reduced from Clarity VX Pro. And if you don't hear much that sounds like it's been processed at all, then I don't know what to tell you. You should hear the raw track. Now, regarding picture, I'm still using the Wyze security camera, which is 1080p. However, this week, what is different is that I am taking the footage that is very low quality, bringing it into a program to basically turn it into a one long video clip, because honestly, this thing, separates every minute into a new file, and it drives me crazy when I get into post. However, what I am doing differently in this episode is I'm going to be processing the video in Topaz AI Video Enhancer, which is an upscaling software. It sharpens as long as there's detail there. And that is the point here I wanted to make. I'm not familiar with, as of the time of this recording, what I'm going to be doing in post. It will be one of two things. It will either pull out a great high quality image out of absolute garbage, or at least improve the quality of it, or it will have done such a bad job because there's not enough detail there for it to pick out what's what, which I've seen on a couple of videos that are very low quality. And in that case, it's going to look terrible. And in that case, I'm probably going to embellish it and make it look even worse, just because it will be hilarious to have a very, very bad looking video on this podcast. It's a sound podcast. What do you expect? So without further delay, let's go ahead and get into the question for this episode. I always thought that if you recorded audio, you need a mixer, but most YouTubers say you don't need one. Are they good to have connected up or not? This is a question that comes up quite a bit. Should I get an audio mixer? Well, here's the thing. It depends. That's the most common answer for a lot of sound-related things, because there are a lot of variables that come into play. Like, for example, if you are recording on a microphone for a podcast, you need to digitize that, and that means running it into an audio interface or a recorder. Yeah, I guess you could use a mixer if you want to, but it is not necessary in that circumstance, because all you need to do is just adjust your level someplace, and that would be on the input of the audio interface. So you don't need to have a mixer at all in that circumstance. However, if you are running into some sort of an analog speaker system, if you are doing, if you're doing a podcast that's in front of an audience and it's going out of the speakers and people need to be able to hear, then in that circumstance, you might, and I stress the word might, need a mixer, depending on the kind of controls you need. Now, I would also say that they are not extremely clean if you are trying to get a very inexpensive mixer. Most mixers are designed for either, if they're not used for studio use and very, very high quality, in which case you'd probably never want to buy one. Many times if you see someone using a mixer this day and age, in the digital era, it is actually not a mixer, it is a control surface. That means that it is getting connected up via USB, sometimes wireless, but it usually is USB. It is a device that allows you to control settings of your recorder. I don't know if there's an interface that allows you to use a control surface, but I do know that recorders can. Now, if you're using something like a Sound Devices Mix Pre 6, then that obviously is a recorder, and you could use it as an interface, and a control surface does work with that. So feel free to use something like that if you want to control your levels. Many control surfaces, though, all they do is give you an ability to adjust levels differently. As opposed to using a little knob, it gives you faders, and the trim might be a little more convenient. It might have additional features or something like that that are built into it. But as a rule, it doesn't actually change the audio physically with the way it's recorded. It's going to still record the same way with exception of level. I mean, obviously, if you set your trim and your gain is set, it's going to take that input to heart and it's going to go on the fly. But usually audio does not pass through a control surface the way it does as a mixer. A mixer would basically be an audio, a front-end audio device. It's analog, and then from there it's going to go out to your analog signal chain. But you don't need to have that under most circumstances because there's no reason to have an analog mixer on the front end unless you are trying to go out, loop out of it, and you are trying to do some advanced features that your interface cannot do. Like speakers, like you might need to go, let's say, you might need to go to, if you're at a church, for example, then you might have a setup that goes easily to an analog tape. If some of the people in your congregation are old school and they like to have cassette tapes to listen to, you might go out in your signal chain to multiple different audio cassette recorders. And in that case, you might need to have a mixer for that purpose. Here's the thing though, they're analog. If you get a discount one, even if you get some of the higher end ones, there's still a noise floor because it's still an analog device. You need to be aware of that. If you add more analog devices in your signal chain, there is a chance of that noise floor getting out of control pretty quickly, especially if they're discount items. Even running it through an EQ can sound pretty bad because this day and age, you don't need it, and there's not a huge emphasis on restoring analog gear and or selling analog gear that's extremely high quality. Now, you could get old school stuff that is probably going to be fairly inexpensive if you buy it on something like eBay, and you're probably going to get pretty decent results out of it, but still, the same rules apply. Analog equals noise floor. If you digitize your audio straight out of your microphone in your first gain stage, everything you do down the signal chain is going to be digital. If you need to adjust it and you want to play with it like a mixer, then at least I would say do it as if it was use a control surface. That way you could at least get an idea, an impression of what it's like using a mixer, but it's a control surface. It's simply a digital control for a recorder, but that means getting an external recorder, unless you can somehow use it with the software you use on your computer. And I'm not familiar with that. I'm not really a podcaster. I don't get into things from that end. I always use recorders whenever I do field work or whenever I record something, and then I just take it in, put it on my computer, and do that kind of thing. I don't record on my computer ever unless I'm doing it for a test that you've seen me do on here on SoundSpeed. So do you need an analog mixer? Most likely not. If there's a certain circumstance where you're not recording for a podcast, or you need to have something that is, if you're doing like a podcast live and you need to have controls for, analog speaker, in a studio, in an audience, not a studio audience, but in an audience form, in that case, then you might, but most of the time you're not going to. If you're going into an interface, then you do not, under any circumstances, in my opinion, need to have a mixer, even if you need additional channels. If you need additional channels and you add a mixer on the front end, you don't get isolated recordings of each channel. So if, let's just say you're doing a four-person podcast, and you go into a single channel or even a dual channel USB audio interface, then it's going to still record stereo, and you're going to be combining certain channels that you're going to be recording. And so those are not going to give you any controls of the isolated track. So if you end up speaking over someone else, there's no correcting it in post. You can't do that unless you have an isolated recording, which is not an option with a mixer. So that's one of the big disadvantages. Even with regards to distribution amplification, if you need to have it go out to multiple different pairs of headphones, at that point, as opposed to getting a mixer, I would say get a stronger, higher quality device, like, for example, where in the world are you going, dude? Someone's trying to, cut us off. Sorry about that. Nature of driving home. In that circumstance, something like a Rodecaster Pro or Rodecaster Pro 2, one of those Wyze Cam links or whatever they're called. I'm sure people out there that know podcasting know it, but something like that would probably be a better option for you because it gives you more inputs for your microphones. It might or may not have auto mix, but then something like the Zoom F series, the Field series, you can get an F4. If you watch the internet, you could get an F4, which is a recorder with a built-in auto mix feature fairly inexpensively. I think I've seen them sometimes as cheap as like $350. You can buy them new, or maybe that's the is that the F8N? I don't recall. I do remember seeing, it might have been, no, it wasn't F6. It might have been an F4, it might have been an F8N. I remember seeing one of the two recently used for $350, and it blew my mind because I was like, wait a minute, I remember back when it was first released, no way in the world they would record it or release it for that price. But I think the F4 has been discontinued. I'm not 100% sure on that. What I will tell you is that if you happen to already own something like a Sound Devices Mix Pre 3, 6, or 10, even the original versions, you can still get Mix Assist, which is pretty awesome because what it allows you to do is it doesn't do gain sharing like something like Dugan Auto Mix does, like the 6 series Sound Devices recorders. What it would do instead is it will pick the channel that is the loudest, and it will bring all the others down. It will attenuate all the others. So whoever's speaking is going to have the main amount of signal. Now, some people like it because it has a lower noise floor when it only plays one channel at a time. Some people dislike it because two people can't speak over each other at the same time. It would sound really weird if two people are arguing or debating and talking over each other, but then guess what? You don't need to have that anyway. And if you need to do something like that and you need you don't like what the auto mix does, then you can always take it back into post and correct it because you have isolated tracks, not tracks, on your Mix Pre 6. So that is an option as well, auto mix. But that would not be something I would recommend to do if you were going into an analog board, even if it has auto mix, even if it does have a feature where it does compression. Allows you to compress the audio, even if it allows you to remove the noise off of the audio input before it goes into the mixer, and then you compress it from there. I still don't recommend it because in the analog world, unless you go higher end, you're not going to find something that's decent quality with multiple inputs and a low noise floor if you're trying to stay on a budget. And if you're spending that money, at that point, you might as well get yourself a recorder that has auto mix built into it. But regardless, that is my information and advice for you regarding, do you need an audio mixer? Unless you're doing a live event, you need to have all those extra inputs and control over it because you're going out over speaker system or something along those lines, I would say absolutely not. Get yourself a multi-channel interface as opposed to a mixer, and if you want to have the mixer type feel, get yourself a control surface for that. For the pro sound advice part of this episode, I thought I would discuss with you detail coming through a microphone. Now, you know how a capsule more or less works, depending on whether it's a pressure operated dynamic type microphone capsule, if it's a pressure gradient, condenser type microphone capsule, if it's a ribbon, whatever the case may be, sound, acoustic vibrations goes into that microphone. Now, here's the thing. Engineers design a microphone to be most detailed and to sound best coming down the barrel. Or, in the case of a side address microphone, going straight at the capsule. Whatever this configuration is for that, it's going to be when you are directly facing it square to the middle of it. So if this is the capsule right here, then I'm going to be facing it this way with my mouth, or whatever the sound is I'm recording. If it is an end address microphone, I'm going to have to point it at me because the capsule is still on the inside facing my mouth. So there's a lot of little aspects of sound that are going to be picked up and in optimal fidelity if you do that. Now, some capsules have the ability to go off axis, and it still has, if you look at the polar pattern, it still looks like it picks up pretty evenly all the way around. That is true. A cardioid pattern microphone, for example, you could go almost to like 135 degrees off axis, and it'll still pretty much pick you up the same way as it does from the front, with exception of detail and other specifications too. But detail is the biggest one that you're going to be able to hear. The reason for this is, and people don't think about this, because when you look at the polar response, the impulse responses are simply the ability of a capsule to pick up different frequencies. There is a video I did called The Spec That We Want But Will Never Get. That's detail. They're never going to give you a specification for detail, because if they did, then you would be looking for a microphone that has a certain detail. It may be that if it's too detailed, that would be a 10, and you're like, geez, it just sounds really, really bad. I can't have a microphone that has a detail level of 10. And if and people will say online, if it's below 6, it's not worth buying. And that's going to shut out a lot of people that make discount products. And so you don't necessarily want to have detail as a spec, or at least the manufacturers don't, because then it's going to shun out a whole lot of microphones, or people are going to feel like they're getting a really bad garbage microphone if the specification was low on that. A polar impulse response chart will at least tell you where the frequencies are going into the capsule, but doesn't tell you anything about the detail. And so it is very easy for you to, on a cardioid pattern microphone, go straight down the barrel and it sound pretty loud. It's still going to be picking up all the frequencies. You go off axis 90 degrees, maybe even more than that, and it's still picking you up relatively even frequency-wise. But detail-wise, it's fallen off. Detail-wise, it's not going to sound the same. That's one of the reasons why us boom operators, we don't just float a microphone between two people speaking if they're like 2 feet apart. We don't just put a microphone between the two of them. We have to actually cue the microphone or physically move it in space over the people who are speaking when they're speaking. Because if we just put a microphone hovering between the two of them, then the detail is going to fall right off when you get slightly off axis, and it's not going to sound right. The detail isn't going to be there in their voice. It's one of the reasons why boom operating takes a lot of skill. But when you're talking about some patterns of microphone, like for example, the figure of 8, or the binaural as they refer to it, where you have a basically, like, let's just use a ribbon as an example. Sound can come in from this direction or in this direction on a ribbon microphone. And if there's detail coming in on one side of it, and then there's detail coming in from the other side of it, you might say it's going to be the same. It's not actually on most ribbon microphones. As a matter of fact, every ribbon microphone I've ever heard, they're not 100% detailed, the same exact detail on the positive and on the negative sphere, on the globe pickup pattern. So that is something you should definitely consider, is that when you use a figure of 8 microphone, you may say, well, that one has a positive globe and it has a negative globe, and those are the same, except one is out polarity with the other. Not really. It doesn't really work that way. And the reason why is because it is still going to be better detail on one side of that capsule. Now you may say, well, omnidirectional capsules then, those are going to be the same detail all the way around. No, not true. The reason why is because an omnidirectional pattern works different than any other pattern of microphone. For example, if I have a cardioid pattern facing straight at me, if I go off axis, then the sweet spot of that, which is down the barrel of the capsule, is not going to be centered on that microphone picking up optimum fidelity anymore, right? So there is a sweet spot right there for you to be down on that microphone. An omnidirectional microphone doesn't really have a proximity effect and doesn't really have a sweet spot. I mean, you will hear me argue that it's down the barrel where it is the optimum fidelity hitting the capsule most square. That is the best way to put it. Because even if you go off axis with an omnidirectional pattern, it may be picking up every single angle evenly, frequency-wise, but it is still going to fall off in detail when you rotate all the way around. Think about this. The pattern of a microphone that's omnidirectional may be able to pick up all frequencies at all angles, including if you point the microphone the other way. But where is that detail? It may be picking up through reflections the rear part of that microphone, but the capsule is still on the front side of that microphone being blocked by a bunch of metal. So in that circumstance, it's very easy for you to imagine that any vibrations acoustically that go through the air may be colored a little bit by skipping down the metal, or affected by the metal of the microphone itself. But when you get on the when you hear the recording, you're going to hear that the detail isn't there as well as it is if you were going straight down the barrel. And consider this: If you have a cardioid pattern microphone and you go off axis to that, you know the sweet spot is right where everything converges, all the sound converges. Even on a binaural pattern that has two different globes, it's very easy for you to look at it and say, down the barrel is going to be the optimal detail. But on an omnidirectional pattern, there's nothing visually on the polar impulse response graph that tells you which side is the ideal. But you know, going straight down the barrel of the capsule, it's going to be ideal because there is no sweet spot on that microphone. You don't have any, as I mentioned before, proximity effect is going to basically not really be a thing. And the reason why is because there is no sweet spot for it to focus on and to create its signature sound by you being on axis to that particular angle. Instead, it's picking up all sounds, summing it together through one microphone output, the one XLR feed, or if you're using a USB, whatever the case may be. However, if you take all the angles and you basically say it's picking up sound evenly, and you go at any particular angle other than directly down the barrel, it may be picking up those frequencies correctly and optimally with regards to frequency representation and acquiring all those frequencies. But what it is not doing is talking about the detail. The detail is going to be when you're down the barrel of the capsule yet again. And you could hear this on a lavalier microphone very easily. If you put it on your chest, pointed up towards your mouth, it's going to be good detail. You turn it upside down to avoid rain or something like that, or put it inside of a tie, it's going to sound a little bit off axis. It's going to sound a little bit less detailed. It's still going to be detailed enough because all the sound of the entire globe that it's picking up in 360 is still going to have the sound that it cares about coming through one little bitty part of it. So on a big, huge, if you imagine everything around you in 360 and you were to point in one direction and that's the way the mouth is coming in, that's all the vibrations. It's still summing together all the different angles of sound that comes in, and that's the way it basically is working. That's one of the reasons why proximity effect does not work on an omnidirectional pattern microphone unless it happens to, unless they really design it to as such. So there you have it, yet another episode of the Speed Bumps podcast in the can. Be sure to tell me in the comments down below if you are enjoying the podcast, if you'd like me to continue it, or if you think it's a waste of your time and mine. I would love to hear your comments. Now, keep in mind, the sound is not going to be crystal clear and perfect like it is on some podcasts that actually don't record in a car. But hey, that's the reason why. I'm processing the audio to try to get my signal over the background noise. And I think Clarity VX Pro is doing a pretty good job so far. But anyway, I'd love to hear your comments down below. And I want to hear what your comments are regarding Topaz AI Video Enhancer on this the security camera footage on the $35 square microphone there, or not microphone, camera there, security camera. There's no other camera I could think of that is extremely low lux that's able to pick it up unless you go infrared. I could go old school infrared and pull out infrared camera and then my eyes would be glowing because my eyes would look dilated and everything. I remember the way it used to look back 20 years ago when I had infrared on a mini DV camera. It would see in pitch darkness just fine, but it was always green. And I would usually, whenever I did something with that footage, I'd turn it monochrome. I'd just take the green out and make it black and white. If that's what you want, let me know in the comments below. Just whatever. Anyway, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Speed Bumps podcast. Be sure to tune in the future for at least one more question being answered from audience members like you, pro sound tips, and as always, sound advice.
Alan sure does talk fast, doesn't he? If you want to have him talk fast to you with your question, send him an email. Audio, video, text, whatever. ssp@soundspeeds.us. If you want to record this outro so you have to stop listening to me do it, there's details in the description. Just find it there. If you want to find Alan on social media, have him tweet at you, just find all his stuff at soundspeeds.us. And while you're here, could you do him a solid and subscribe, turn on notifications for more sound-related content. Thank you.